Bigfoot saved my son from the river. My son should have drowned that day. 3 grown men couldn't reach him. But something else did. I'm 45 years old. I live in Montana, same as I've lived my whole life. I'm not going to give you my last name, and I'm not going to give you the name of the river. You'll understand why by the time I'm done. What I will tell you is this. My son is alive today, sitting in his room down the hall right now doing homework, because of something I cannot explain. Something that, by every rule I understood about the natural world before that day, should not have been there. I have a photograph from that morning. I'm going to tell you about it before this story is over, and I'm going to tell you exactly what's hidden in it, because once you see it, you won't be able to stop thinking about it any more than I have for 8 years. I've told this story exactly twice in 8 years. Once to my wife, the night it happened. Once to a park ranger who didn't believe a word of it and wrote "subject experienced acute stress reaction" on his incident report. I'm telling it a 3rd time now, to you, because my son is getting older, and one day he's going to ask me again what really happened on that riverbank. And I want there to be an honest record of it somewhere before that day comes. So let me take you back to the beginning. The trip. It was the first weekend of June, 8 years ago. My son had just turned 10. I want you to understand something about him at that age, because it matters for everything that comes after. He was a quiet kid, thoughtful, the kind of boy who'd rather sit next to you and watch the water than talk your ear off. He'd had a rough school year, some trouble with a couple of kids in his class, nothing dramatic, but enough that he'd come home some afternoons quieter than usual, and I'd see it in his shoulders before he even said a word. I'd been planning this trip for months because of that, honestly. Just the 2 of us, no phones, a tent, 2 fishing rods, and 3 days along a stretch of river I'd fished since I was younger than he was. My own father had taken me to that same river when I was about that age, and there was something about handing that down to him that felt like it mattered more than just a fishing trip. I remember the drive up clearly, in a way I don't remember most ordinary days from that period of my life. He had his window down the whole way, even though it was cold enough that his mother would have made him roll it up if she'd been there. He kept asking me questions about the mountains, about whether we'd see elk, about whether the fish up there were bigger than the ones at the pond near our house. At one point he asked me, completely out of nowhere, if I thought animals got scared the same way people did. I told him I figured they probably did. He thought about that for a long time before he said anything else. I didn't know it yet, but that drive was the last easy hour either of us would have for a long time. We set up camp early in the afternoon, a flat spot about 40 yards back from the riverbank, far enough that we wouldn't hear the current all night, close enough that we could walk down with our rods in 5 minutes. He helped me stake the tent corners, proud of himself every time he got one right on the first try. And I let him build the fire ring, even though it took him 3 times longer than it would have taken me, because some things matter more than efficiency. The river that weekend was running high. I want to be honest about that detail, because it matters more than I understood at the time. It had been a wet spring. Snowpack runoff was still feeding into it from higher elevation, and even though the water looked calm enough on the surface near our camp, I should have respected what that meant further downstream, where the channel narrows. I didn't think much of it that first evening. We caught nothing, laughed about it, ate beans out of a pot too hot to hold with bare hands, and fell asleep early, both of us worn out from the drive. I remember him falling asleep mid-sentence, telling me about some video game he liked, and I remember thinking, lying there listening to him breathe, that this was about as good as life got. I look back on that night now, and I think about how normal it was, how nothing about it gave any warning for what was coming. I'd give almost anything to go back and live inside that one ordinary evening for just a little longer before I knew what the next morning held. The second day. We woke up to a clear morning, the kind that makes you forget how cold a Montana night can get. My son was up before me, already pulling his boots on, asking if we could go down to the river before breakfast. I should have made him eat first. That's one of the thoughts that stayed with me longer than almost any other detail from that day. Something so small, so ordinary, that in another version of that morning, it might have changed everything. We walked down together. The river was loud that morning, louder than the evening before, which should have told me something about how much water was actually moving through that channel. I noticed it, even commented on it to him, and I still walked us down to fish anyway. That's a detail I don't get to take back, no matter how many times I wish I could. We found a spot where the bank widened out into a gravel bar, shallow enough at the edges that I let him wade in up to his shins while I rigged our lines. I want you to picture this normally, because it was normal. A father and son fishing rods, a Tuesday quiet morning. Nothing unusual at all. I had no idea, kneeling there threading a hook, that I was living through the last few ordinary minutes either of us would have for the rest of that day. Then he saw something on a rock about 15 feet upstream, near where the bank narrowed and the current picked up speed. He said it might have been a crawdad, and before I could tell him to wait for me, he was already moving toward it, picking his way across the wet rocks at the edge of the water. I called after him to be careful. I remember that clearly, because it's the last normal thing I said to him before everything changed. What happened in the next 4 seconds is something I have relived more times than I could ever count, and something that, at the time, I had no way of knowing would lead to an encounter I still can't fully explain. The fall. The rock he stepped onto was covered in a thin film of algae, invisible from where I stood. His foot went out from under him completely. No warning, no slow stumble. Just gone, like the rock had been greased. He went into the water at an angle, and the current at that point in the river was moving faster than anything I'd accounted for when I let him wade out that far. I'd misjudged it. I want to say that plainly, because there's no version of this story where I get to leave that part out. I misjudged how strong that water was, and my son paid for it. He went under almost immediately. When he came back up, he was already 6, 7 feet downstream, and the current had him completely. I was in the water within a second or two of seeing him go under. I'm certain of that much. But a second or two is an eternity in moving water, and by the time I reached the spot where he'd fallen, he was already well past me, being pulled toward the narrows where the river dropped and the current ran fastest. I want you to understand what that felt like, not metaphorically. Literally. The moment your body understands, before your mind catches up, that you are not fast enough, not strong enough, and the person you would trade your own life for, without a half-second of hesitation, is being taken away from you by something with no malice and no mercy at all. Just water, doing what water does. I screamed his name. I don't remember deciding to scream it. It just came out of me. And that's when I learned I wasn't the only person at that river who just heard it. The other camper. There was a campsite about 100 yards downriver from ours, and the man staying there, I never learned his full name, only that his camp neighbors called him Russ, came sprinting out of the trees when he heard me yelling. He'd been filling a water jug at the bank and heard the panic in my voice before he even understood the words. Russ was a big man, looked like he'd done physical work his whole life, and without a second of hesitation, he waded out into that current to try to cut my son off downstream. I want to give him every bit of credit he deserves, because what he did took real courage. He got close. Closer than I had any right to expect a stranger to get. His hand actually brushed my son's jacket at one point. By his own account afterward, fingers closing on wet fabric for half a second, before the current ripped it away from him too. 2 grown men, strong swimmers, both of us, in water that should not have been able to outmatch us as completely as it did. It did anyway. My son was being carried downstream faster than either of us could move on land, let alone in the water. And within another 20 or 30 seconds, the river bent hard to the right, into a stretch neither Russ nor I had ever walked, lined with boulders too large to climb quickly and brush too thick to run through. I remember thinking, with a clarity that terrifies me to this day, that I was about to watch my son disappear around that bend, and that I might never see him alive again. I want to tell you exactly what that thought does to a man's body. It doesn't feel like the movies. It's not a scream and a sprint. For 1 or 2 seconds, it's total paralysis. Your legs forget how to work. Your vision narrows down to a tunnel, and somewhere underneath all of it, a voice you don't recognize as your own is already starting to grieve something that hasn't happened yet. I didn't have time for that paralysis. I forced my legs to move. I scrambled along the bank, falling twice on wet rock, screaming his name into the roar of the water. I had no idea, rounding that bend, that I was about to see something that would change how I understood the world for the rest of my life. The figure. There was a third person at the river that morning, a woman camping with her husband, about a quarter-mile downstream from where my son had fallen in. I wouldn't learn her name was Carol until later that day, and I wouldn't hear what she actually saw until much later than that, not because she was hiding it, but because in the chaos of that morning, none of us had time to compare notes. We were all just reacting. What I knew in the moment was only this. Somewhere ahead of me, around a bend I hadn't reached yet, something had already changed about that river. I could hear it before I could see it, a different quality to the commotion up ahead. Voices that weren't mine, weren't Russ's, shouting something I couldn't make out over the water. I didn't know yet whether that meant help had arrived, or whether it meant something far worse was happening to my son than I could already imagine. I didn't see any of this myself, not yet. I was still 100 yards back, scrambling over rocks, screaming, completely unaware of what was actually happening at that river just out of my sight. What I saw next when I finally rounded that bend myself, is something I have never been able to fully reconcile with anything I understood about the natural world before that morning. The river, when I came around that bend, gasping, soaked, certain I was about to see the worst moment of my life play out in front of me, the first thing I registered was a man and a woman standing frozen on the far bank, both of them staring at something in the water that I couldn't yet see clearly through the spray. The second thing I registered was my son's jacket, a bright orange shape, still visible above the surface, still moving, not just drifting. Moving in a way the current alone couldn't explain, steady, controlled, cutting toward the bank instead of away from it, like something underneath the surface had taken hold of him and changed the direction of the entire river around his body. I didn't understand what I was looking at. For 2 or 3 full seconds, I genuinely could not process what my own eyes were telling me, because nothing about it matched any explanation I had available. Then I saw what was moving him. There was something enormous in that river with him. Something dark, broad through the back and shoulders in a way that no man I had ever seen could match, standing in water that was fully chest-deep on Russ, just a few hundred yards upstream. And yet this thing stood in it, like the current barely registered against its weight at all. I want to be honest about my first assumption, because I think it matters for you to understand exactly how my mind processed what I was looking at. I assumed bear. In that first half-second, panic and instinct reached for the only explanation that made any sense to a man who has spent his life around Montana wildlife. Bears do not stand fully upright in chest-deep current and hold their ground without being swept downstream themselves. This thing did, and it was reaching for my son. What I watched happen in the next 10 seconds is something 3 other adults independently described to me in the days after, in almost identical detail. And to this day, none of us can fully agree on what we should call it, the reach. I want to walk through this part carefully, because it's the part of this story people find hardest to accept, and I understand why. I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm telling you what I saw, exactly as I saw it, with no exaggeration added in 8 years of retelling it to myself in the dark. The figure's arm, and I use that word because nothing else fits, even though I know how strange it sounds, extended into the current ahead of where my son was being carried, not grabbing wildly, not flailing the way you or I would in that water, fighting against a current that strong. Positioned, deliberate, the kind of placement you'd expect from something that understood exactly how that current moved, and exactly where it needed to be standing to intercept what it was carrying. My son hit that arm, and instead of being swept past it the way he'd been swept past Russ's hand minutes earlier, he stopped. I've asked myself 100 times since that day how something could hold its ground against a current capable of sweeping 2 grown men entirely off their feet. I don't have a physics answer for you. I only have what I watched happen with my own eyes from 100 feet away, in full daylight, with 2 other adult witnesses watching the exact same thing happen from the opposite bank. It lifted him, not yanked, not thrown over a shoulder, the way you'd handle something you were trying to get out of danger as fast as possible, with no regard for how roughly you did it. Lifted, the way you'd lift a person you were being careful with, cradling him against its chest with one arm while it used the other to steady itself against the current. For 3 or 4 seconds, my son's body went completely still in its grip. I didn't know, in that moment, whether that stillness meant he was alive or whether I had arrived just in time to watch something else entirely. I have never been more afraid in my life than I was in those 3 or 4 seconds. The carry to shore. The figure began moving toward the bank on my side of the river, Russ's side, and the side I was scrambling toward as fast as my legs would carry me. I want you to understand what that water was doing to it. The current at that point in the river was strong enough that it had carried my son, an adult man's failed rescue attempt, and very nearly a second adult man's rescue attempt as well, downstream with what felt like effortless, indifferent power. This thing walked through that same water carrying my son's full weight against its body, and the current did not move it more than a foot or 2 off a direct line to the bank. I don't have an explanation for the kind of strength that takes. I've asked physical therapists. I've asked a physician friend of mine. I've asked anyone with relevant expertise who would listen to me describe it without looking at me like I'd lost my mind. Nobody has ever given me an answer that satisfied me. It reached the shallows near the bank within what felt like 10 or 15 seconds, though I'd give anything to tell you that number with real confidence. Time does strange things to a man watching his child's life hang in the balance. It did not throw him onto dry land, the way an animal in a hurry to be rid of something might. It set him down, carefully, on a flat shelf of rock just above the waterline, in a motion that I can only describe, even now, as gentle. Then it looked up, and it looked directly at me. The look I was maybe 30 feet away by that point, soaked to the waist, completely out of breath, every part of me screaming to get to my son. But for 1 full second, and I know it was a full second, because I have replayed it in my mind enough times to count it out like a metronome, I stopped. Because the thing that had just pulled my son from that river was looking directly into my eyes, and every part of my body braced for something I didn't have a name for yet. I want to tell you honestly what I saw in that look, even though I know exactly how it sounds. There was nothing predatory in it. No aggression, no posturing. None of the things every instinct I had about dangerous wildlife told me to expect from something that size at that distance. What I saw, for that 1 second, read to me as something closer to recognition. Acknowledgement. The kind of look you might exchange with another parent at a playground in the half-second after their kid almost falls off the monkey bars and doesn't. I don't know how to make that claim sound less strange than it is. I'm telling you what I perceived in the rawest, most adrenaline-soaked moment of my entire life, for whatever that testimony is worth to you. Then it turned, and it was gone. The disappearance. I don't mean gone slowly. I mean that in the time it took me to blink and look back toward my son to confirm he was breathing. When I turned my head back toward the tree line, there was nothing there. No sound of brush breaking. No visible movement in the timber along that bank. Just absence, total and immediate, where a moment before there'd been something the size of a grown bull elk standing upright in the water. I reached my son seconds later. He was breathing, coughing up river water, terrified, freezing, but breathing and conscious. and looking up at me with an expression I will never be able to fully describe to anyone who wasn't there. I want to tell you what he said to me, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. He said, "Dad, something big helped me." I didn't ask him anything else in that moment. I just held him. Russ reached us a minute later, soaked and shaken nearly as badly as I was, and the woman from downstream and her husband made their way around to our side of the river not long after that. Both of them already talking, almost on top of each other, about what they'd just watched happen from the opposite bank. It was Carol who said something first that I still haven't been able to shake. She told me she'd seen the whole thing happen from much closer than I had, almost from the start, and that what she watched move along that bank before it ever reached my son did not, in her words, move like anything she'd ever seen in 30 years of camping in that country. Her first thought, she told me, was bear, a big one. Her instinct was to grab her husband and get away from the water entirely, because nothing about a bear that size, moving with that kind of purpose along a riverbank, read as anything but dangerous. Then she said something that I've turned over in my mind more times than almost any other detail in this entire story. She said the shape didn't move like a bear at all. It moved upright, on two legs. Not the brief upright lurch you sometimes see from a startled bear rearing up to look around. Sustained, balanced, bipedal movement, covering ground along that bank faster than she believed something that size should have been able to move. 4 adults, 1 child, all of us having just witnessed the same impossible thing from slightly different angles, all of us groping for some kind of explanation that didn't require us to believe something that, by every rule any of us understood about the natural world, should not have existed. The aftermath: we got my son back to camp, got him warm, got dry clothes on him, and I made the decision almost immediately that we were ending the trip and getting him to a hospital, more out of caution than because anything appeared seriously wrong. He'd swallowed water, he was shaken, he had some scrapes from the rocks, but physically he was remarkably, almost unbelievably okay, given what he had just been through. He didn't say much on the walk back to camp. I kept glancing down at him every few steps, half expecting him to fall apart, and instead he just held my hand, tighter than he had in years, and kept his eyes on the trail. It wasn't until we were almost back to the tent that he said it again, quieter this time, almost like he was testing whether I'd believed him the first time. "Dad, it wasn't a person and it wasn't a bear. It was something else." I didn't have an answer for him yet. I'm not sure I fully have one now, 8 years later. It was Russ who first suggested we go back to the spot where the figure had set him down before we packed up and left. He said quietly, almost like he didn't want to say it out loud, that he wanted to see if there was anything there. There was. In the soft mud just above the waterline, exactly where the figure had been standing when it set my son down, there were tracks. 2 of them, clear enough that none of us needed to debate what we were looking at. They were enormous, significantly larger than any boot print, longer and wider than my own foot, by a considerable margin, with a depth in that soft mud that suggested a weight far beyond what any of us, even Russ, who outweighed me by a good 50 pounds, could have produced standing in that same spot. Carol's husband had a camera with him. This was 8 years ago, so a real camera, not just a phone. And he took several photographs of those tracks before the rest of us trampled the area further, getting my son's gear and ourselves back to the trail. Those photographs exist. I have copies of them still, in a drawer in my house that I don't open very often. And there's one detail in those photographs that none of us noticed standing there in the mud that morning. Something I wouldn't catch myself until almost a year later, looking through them again on a night I couldn't sleep. The report. We reported what happened to a ranger station on our way out, partly because I felt we had an obligation to flag the river hazard for other campers, and partly, I'll admit, because some part of me needed to say what had happened out loud to someone in an official capacity, even though I already knew how it would sound. The ranger who took our statement was professional and patient, and I could see him visibly struggling with how to write down what 4 independent adult witnesses, plus a 10-year-old boy, were all describing to him with total consistency. He documented the near drowning. He documented the river conditions, which he confirmed were unusually dangerous that week due to snowpack runoff exceeding seasonal norms. He took a copy of the photographs. What he wrote about the figure itself was a single line buried in an incident report, describing witnesses as reporting a large animal, possibly a bear standing upright, assisting in the rescue, with a note that the description could not be corroborated due to lack of additional physical evidence beyond unidentified tracks. I don't say that with bitterness. I understand the position that Ranger was in. There was no box on his form, no protocol, no language built for what 4 adults and a child were trying to tell him they'd watched with their own eyes. The tracks were never cast in plaster. No specialist was ever brought in. As far as I know, those photographs sat in a file somewhere and were never looked at again by anyone outside of our small group and whoever processed that paperwork. I told you at the start of this story that I'd show you what's hidden in that photograph. Here it is, and it's the detail that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that day. In one of the photographs, taken slightly wider than the others, you can just make out a third partial print, fainter than the 2 clear ones, several feet back from the water's edge, facing toward the tree line instead of toward the river. Carol's husband hadn't even noticed it when he took the photo. I didn't notice it for almost a year, but once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. It meant the thing had paused there, after setting my son down, facing the trees, away from all of us, for at least a moment, before it left. I don't know what that pause means. I've never been able to decide whether it makes the story easier to carry or harder. Why I'm telling you this now. My son is 18 now. He doesn't remember every detail of that day with the same clarity I do. That's normal, I'm told, for a child who experienced something traumatic at that age. But he remembers being in the water. He remembers being terrified. And he remembers, with a certainty that has never once wavered in 8 years, being lifted by something large and warm and impossibly strong, and being set down gently on dry land by something that, in his own words, didn't feel like it wanted to hurt me at all. I've gone back over every alternative explanation more times than I can count. I've asked myself whether 4 adults, in the adrenaline of a child's near drowning, could have collectively misperceived a bear's movement as something more human-like than it actually was. I think that's a fair question to ask, and I don't think I can rule it out completely, even now. but Carol's account of its posture, independent of mine. Russ's account of its size relative to the current it stood in. My own account of the look it gave me, and the way it set my son down rather than simply depositing him as fast as possible. The tracks, photographed before any of us had the chance to second-guess what we'd seen. All of it points toward the same conclusion, even though none of us can prove it, and even though I understand exactly how it sounds to someone who wasn't standing on that riverbank. I think about that look it gave me more than almost anything else from that day. Not menace, not aggression. Something that, if I'm honest with myself, felt closer to understanding than anything else I have words for. Some nights, when my son is out late with friends and the house is quiet, I find myself thinking about that riverbank again, about how close I came to a version of my life where this house stays quiet for an entirely different reason. And in those moments, whatever that thing was, I find myself grateful to it, in a way I don't fully know how to express to anyone who wasn't standing in that water with me. I don't need anyone watching this to believe me. I've made peace with that a long time ago. What I need, the only thing I've ever really needed from telling this story, is for there to be an honest account of it somewhere, in case my son ever wants more than his own 8-year-old memory to hold on to. I don't know what pulled my son from that river. I only know that if it hadn't been there, he wouldn't be here today.